Dear Antony, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the 2025 Amundi World Investment Forum and to kick off our event by discussing recent geopolitical shifts. The G7 summit took place last week in Canada under a tense international context, to say the least. There seems to be no end in sight to the Russia-Ukraine war, and the situation in the Middle East has recently obviously escalated. So my first question is, would you say, as stated by President Zelensky, that diplomacy is in crisis?
Well, first let me say, how was your week? It's wonderful to be with you, Valérie. Thank you. And thank you to the wonderful team at Amundi for putting this together. To be here right next to the Louvre, I mean, several people told me that I was ready to be put in a museum. I didn't know that they meant it quite literally. But I'm so pleased to be with all of you today. And let me say to your question, look, there was a wonderful, extraordinary American diplomat, politician, some of you may have known years ago, by the name of George Mitchell. And he was the one who, on behalf of President Clinton, negotiated, the Northern Ireland peace. And he had the best description, I thought, of diplomacy of anyone I've ever heard. He called that process 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. And the point is this, when it comes to diplomacy, it's a never-ending process. It's not simply a light switch. President Trump this week was talking, and this is very positive, about a possible agreement now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Also, the DRC and Rwanda. That would be great. But that didn't just happen. When it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan, we had, during our administration, 2 years' worth, in close collaboration with the European Union, of negotiations to get to a peace agreement between the two. I had the foreign ministers from both countries in Washington. We basically locked them in a room for a week until they came to agreements. And the peace agreement that hopefully is finally within reach is the product of that. DRC and Rwanda. There, my former colleague, Avril Haines, who was the head of national intelligence, negotiated an agreement with both presidents. I backed her up with President Tshisekedi and President Kagame. And if there's an agreement now, it's the product of that. When we had a ceasefire in Gaza, so desperately needed again, and hostages released, that was the product of diplomacy, an agreement that President Biden put forward, and a lot of diplomacy to bring the world behind it. So my point is, yes, you can say on one level, is it in crisis? Yes, but that's almost the natural state of diplomacy. And when it comes to the Middle East and Ukraine, I just say this very quickly. Look, usually, the real role of diplomacy, of course, is to prevent a conflict from happening in the first place. But if you don't succeed at that, it's, of course, to end a conflict, to find peace. And that usually happens three ways. It's either imposed from the outside by other parties, or one side wins or has a decisive advantage, or both parties fight, in effect, to exhaustion and sue for peace. When it comes to the Middle East, particularly with regard to Iran, I think there is now a moment where one side has suffered a significant setback. That can be translated with diplomacy, hopefully, into something more enduring, especially when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. With Ukraine and Russia, I'm afraid we're right now in a war of attrition that doesn't show any signs of letting up. I suspect that as long as we continue to support Ukraine, and we have to do that, that even though Russia has an advantage in a war of attrition, Ukraine has innovation on its side. It has its determination to hold on to its own country, and it has the support from all of us. If that continues, eventually, it will get to a point where both parties say enough is enough, and that's when diplomacy comes in.
Thank you for that. Let's switch to policymaking in the Trump era. You have worked for 3 American administrations over the span of your fantastic career, under President Clinton, Obama, and Biden. From your perspective, how does policymaking under President Trump differ from that of the previous administrations?
It's a very elegant question. And now you're going to see diplomacy in action. So, You know, thinking about this seriously for a minute, and I've tried to observe this very carefully, Valerie, both during the first Trump administration, of course I'm watching it very carefully now. I think if you look at most American administrations, certainly since the Second World War, and especially since the 1960s, when the system that we've been using for all these years was really put in place, mostly by President Kennedy, when it comes to foreign policy, you basically had a bottom-up approach. Now you have a top-down approach, and the top is sometimes a little hard to predict. But what do I mean by that? There was a system that developed, and it had what I would call 3 Ps: people, process, policy. You try to bring in the best people, the most expert. You try to create a process in which everyone is around the same table, and every different perspective is heard, and you can try to work out second and third order effects of the decisions you're going to make. Testing everyone's assumptions. And then finally, you develop a policy, the president blesses it, and at least you have a roadmap. And you know, Mike Tyson, the fighter, used to say that the best plans usually don't survive getting punched in the face, but at least you have a place to start. And your adversaries, your friends, all know more or less where you're going. Now we have a very different approach, which, as I said, is again very top-down. And you know, that can work too, but I worry about this. If you think about the autocratic countries in this world, they each have an Achilles heel, and it's the same one. It's the inability of anyone in an autocratic system to speak truth to power, either because they can't or they won't. And what we have to avoid, one way or another, is making sure that we don't evolve in that way. That people have the confidence to be able to say, this doesn't make sense, this is a mistake, this is wrong, we need to think about this again. Not simply provide an opinion that they believe reflects where the commander-in-chief is wanting to take the country. If we do that, this system can work. If we don't, it's a little bit more difficult.
Clear. Can I ask you what are the core foreign policy interests that President Trump would like to change, but will likely survive this administration?
Valerie, I think this goes to, in many ways, what's defined us and characterized us for the last 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, and what will actually be enduring, even if there are some current challenges. So I have my own bias on this, and I may be proven wrong. And forgive me, because this is a little bit parochial. I'll speak as an American. First, I think that the imperative of American leadership and American engagement remains enduring. And it's pretty simple from our perspective. The world doesn't organize itself. If we're not part of the organizing, then I think one of two things happens. Either someone else comes in and does the organizing, and probably not in a way that reflects our own interests and values, or maybe just as bad, no one does it. And then you tend to have a vacuum, or you tend to have something that is filled by bad things before it's filled by good things. So I think this premium on American engagement will remain, even if sometimes it's a little bit in retreat. And you know the old expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So think about it this way. All sorts of rules, norms, decisions are being made about the future, and they're happening at tables in conference rooms without windows around the world. Maybe it's what are the rules of trade in digital services. For example, if we're not there, we're not going to be shaping what those rules and norms are. But there's a flip side to this, and that is, I believe, more than ever before in my 30-some-odd years of doing this, there's an imperative, a premium, on finding ways to collaborate and coordinate with others. Because the reality is, and I think we'll find this out the hard way, we simply can't do alone what we need to do in order to meet the interests of our people. The things that are affecting them in their lives demand collaboration, demand coordination, demand cooperation. Back in COVID days, which I know seem like distant, ancient history to people, there was a reason why we were slow. But finally, with France, with the UK, with other countries, we ended up providing over 1 billion vaccines around the world, free of charge, no political strings attached, unlike some other countries. Now, I happen to believe that was the right thing to do, but it was also the necessary thing to do for ourselves, because we know that, for example, if other countries were allowed or had to face this without assistance, a new variant of COVID could emerge, and everything we'd done at home could be put in jeopardy. It would come back and bite us. And that's the final thing I'd mention. The way we described how America operated in the world for the last 80 years, very imperfectly, was something called enlightened self-interest. That is, the success of others is actually to our advantage, to our success. And we made those investments, and those investments came back to us 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. New markets for our products, new partners to deal with these global challenges, new allies to deter aggression. And I think right now, we may have lost a little bit sight of enlightened self-interest. I believe it's enduring. And the last thing is this. The secret sauce that we had was making the right and smart investments in ourselves. Last year, at the end of the Biden presidency, we had about 3.5% of GDP that went to research and development, more than $1 trillion a year. 40% of that from the federal government. And of course, we then attracted researchers, scientists, students from all over the world, and we are the most innovative society on Earth. If you walk I think so many of you know, if you walk through any of our research universities in the United States, it looks like you're walking into the United Nations. We may be challenged in that direction for some time, but I believe eventually we have to come back to it because it's why we succeeded.
Coming back to today, geopolitics and security, we must say that President Trump has increased doubts about the US security umbrella for our allies, especially Europe. Do you think it's mostly a bargain chip to get more out of Europeans, or could it be more than that?
Well, look, we're just coming off of the NATO summit, which I think, by all public accounts, was very successful, and that is a good thing. And the truth of the matter is, yes, Europeans should be dedicating more, devoting more, spending more on defense. And that's been the case for some time. But I think it's important also to have a factual basis for this conversation. A long time ago, 2014, at the Wales Summit, it was agreed among the NATO countries that they would each spend 2% of GDP on defense. That's 2014. When President Trump left office the first time, in 2020, or 2021 technically, 9 of the allies were meeting the 2% mark. When President Biden left office, 23 of the allies were meeting the 2% mark, and everyone else had a plan to get there. So that's the reality. Now, what was agreed just now, 5% GDP, that's great. We have to see it realized, but I think it's a very positive thing. The other reality, though, of course, is that whatever an American president says or does, Vladimir Putin is really the one to thank for this commitment to spending more on defense. There's one other thing, Valérie, that I think is so important, and I was very glad to see President Trump do this. This recommitment, this reaffirmation of Article 5 of NATO. And it's one of the things I don't think we've done a good job of explaining to all of our citizens over the years, because we know in the United States, people are tired of war. They saw our country at war in one way or another for the better part of the last 20 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. They don't want these forever wars. I think what we've done a bad job of explaining is NATO and Article 5 is the best preventive medicine, the best way to avoid war in the first place. Why is that? When countries came together to form NATO, they made this bargain, Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. And what that means is a would-be aggressor knows that if they take on one NATO country, they take on every NATO country, including and maybe especially the United States. And that tells them, wait a minute, I better think twice. There's a good reason a NATO country has not been attacked.
Turning now to President Trump's foreign policy in Asia and China, of course, in particular. How do you see US-China relations evolving during President Trump's second mandate?
Well, I think to step back for 1 second, as I've tried to think about how the president sees the world, and so how the United States now acts in the world, I think he has a tremendous affinity, respect for those he sees as strong leaders and strong countries. And in that sense, Putin, Xi Jinping, in different ways, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, President Erdogan in Turkey, a few other places, are what he finds compelling. And at the same time, there's a little bit of a 19th century outlook, where if you think about it, we had a world then that was divided into spheres of influence, where the great powers, the strong countries, were allowed to more or less decide, dictate, dominate what happened in their sphere, and the others were able to do what they wanted in their spheres. And so in this sense, Russia, I think the perspective is let it do what it wants, more or less. China, with the exception of economic issues, let it do what it wants, we'll do what we want. So that brings you to China. And I think, as I said, the exception is the economic relationship. And there, my sense is that the president is very motivated by not the 19th century, but by the 1980s. And then, of course, it was the rise of Japan, Japan Inc., and his perspective that Japan at that point was taking advantage of us. Now, a perspective that China is taking advantage of. And of course, I actually think he's right in large part about that. His first term, he focused things more on China. I think that was right. The way he did it, I would have differences with. And now we're seeing the same thing. So, Taiwan, South China Sea, maybe not so much of interest. The economic aspect of the relationship, very much at the center of his interest. The challenge I see is this. If you're going to be effective in trying to move China off of policies that affect all of us and that we don't like, we're so much better. Here's a good example of doing it in collaboration. To build convergence among the United States, Europe, Northeast Asia, on how to approach this. Because the United States alone, we're what, 25% of world GDP. If we're acting in concert with Europe, with Northeast Asia, suddenly we're 60% of GDP. Much harder for China to ignore. Over the previous 4 years, we built that convergence with Europe and with Northeast Asia, so that on everything from export controls to outward and inward investment to overcapacity, which is a real problem for all of us. China manufactures, 30 some odd percent of goods. It only consumes internally about 13%. So by definition, everything that's getting pushed out risks drowning our own communities, our own workers. So we're right to want to do something about it, but we're so much better off if we're actually doing it together. So I think maybe the president will find that the limitations of going at your allies and partners with tariffs are such that it undermines your ability to effectively deal with China. I hope we see that, because I believe there can be a real convergence of interests and approach among so many countries.
So while we know that President Trump intends to shift his focus towards Asia, the US, of course, are also part of a dense network of relationship in the Middle East. Considering the very recent developments between Israel and Iran and the role played by the US, what are the most likely geopolitical impacts in the future?
So I don't think we're going to know for some time how this plays out. And let's just focus for 1 second on what's been in the news for the last couple of days, and that's Iran's nuclear program. There's a chance, and I hope from my perspective this is the case, that the damage was done was such that it will set back the Iranians for years and years and years, and maybe will actually convince them to engage in a negotiation, to engage in diplomacy that gives us genuine confidence over a long period of time that they will not pursue a nuclear weapon. Now, the irony is, we actually had that agreement during the Obama administration. We negotiated with our European partners and with the EU and with Russia and China this agreement that put Iran's nuclear program in a box, in a very tight box with very careful monitoring, such that had they chosen to produce fissile material at bomb grade, it would have taken them a year to actually do that. We would have seen it. We could have done something about it. President Trump, unfortunately, back then tore up the agreement. Iran started pursuing the enrichment of uranium to near bomb grade levels, and we have this crisis that we reach now. So I believe the only enduring way to really resolve this problem is through some kind of diplomatic agreement. Otherwise, you have to keep going at it militarily. The danger I think we have now is that depending on the decisions that Iran makes, it could choose to negotiate something and recognize the fact that it's at a moment of weakness. It could also choose to simply move ahead with a nuclear program, to bury it even deeper underground, and over time, in a couple of years, rebuild what's been lost. And then we'll be at a disadvantage, not an advantage, because if they rebuild in the way they may be able to, it may be beyond the capacity even of the United States to deal with that program. So I think that's the challenge. More broadly, let me just say this. look, I think this is a moment where you can see what the future of the region could be, the positive future for the region. We saw it when Israel was attacked last year on 2 occasions, when not only the United States but other countries in the region actually came to its defense, despite Gaza, attacked by Iran. We see the possibilities of an Israel that can be integrated into the region, that can finally get an answer to the question that it's had from its founding, which is, when will we be considered a normal country in the region? And were that to happen, Iran would be further isolated, and it would have to make decisions about its own future. But for that to happen, and particularly for there to be, for example, normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which really is the critical objective, we know that certain fundamental things have to happen, including, finally, an end to Gaza, but also, critically, a pathway for the Palestinians to a state of their own. And that, of course, is incredibly difficult because you now have 2 societies, Israel, Palestinians, who've been totally traumatized by everything that's happened on October 7th and every day since. But what's frustrating, also tantalizing, is you can see what that other alternative future can be. It's there, but it's going to take incredible determination, incredible leadership to get over these hurdles and move this to a better place. I still believe, maybe naively, that it's possible. I know that it's necessary.
As you know, the title of this year's forum is Reboot in Progress, Playing by New Rules. We will welcome Professor James Robinson to close today's program. He has written extensively about the relationship between institutions and prosperity. So my last question is, do you think the changes enacted by President Trump will lead to a real long-term shift in domestic politics, to US democracy, and in US political institutions?
So I suspect, like all of you, we're all trying to understand what's happening in this moment. And of course, as you're making decisions, particularly about investments, trying to have that understanding is more essential than ever. So the bad news is this, at least maybe from your perspective, certainly from mine. I think we're in a moment of extraordinary change, extraordinary flux, the kind of moment that we see every 70, 80, maybe 100 years if you look back at history. We were lulled maybe into a false sense of security and normalcy over the last few decades. We're not there anymore. I've been doing this, as I said, for over 30 years. I don't remember a period of time when there was a greater multiplicity, a greater complexity, a greater interconnectedness, and a greater rapidity of problems all coming together. My friend Tom Friedman, the columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column that I loved about 9 months ago, and you'll see why. He wrote a column that said, mothers and fathers, don't let your children grow up to be Secretary of State. It's not like it was when the greats were doing it, Henry Kissinger, Jim Baker. Now we have a multiplicity of actors who are super empowered by technology and by information in ways that they can become disruptors to anything a government's trying to do. 50 years ago, there were 15 people you called around the world to try to get something done. Now it's so much more difficult, so much more challenging. And this very rapidity of change, the depth of change, I think in almost all of our populations has done a couple of things. It's created a sense of chaos, a sense of confusion, of not having a North Star. And that's palpable, certainly in my country. Second, we have, on the one hand, greater equality among nations, but in many places, rising inequality within them. And in this change, those who are left out, those who are left behind, they're fearful. They don't see a better future. They don't see their generation doing even better than the previous generation, which, at least in the United States, has been a staple of our life for since the end of the Second World War. And that breeds, this fear also breeds anger, it breeds resentment. And then you have a perfect environment, chaos, confusion, fear, anger, resentment, a perfect environment politically for populists, for demagogues to say, we have the answer. And people are desperately searching for it. In so many of our countries as well, we have aging populations. And typically with an aging population, governments tend to dedicate resources to those people. That means younger people are not getting the resources they believe that they need and deserve. And that also turns them against governments, against institutions, against elites. So I think we have a perfect storm moment in many ways that we have to find a way to navigate. And of course, that's not it. The technological piece of this, again, as all of you know so well, this is what keeps me up at night. When we have robots taking blue-collar jobs, when we have AI taking white-collar jobs, and also making the robots even better to take more blue-collar jobs, it's a moment of profound dislocation. If you look at the history of technological change, at least as I read it, every time so far, we have wound up in a better place on the other shore. But what bothers me now, more than anything else, is it's the getting there. Because information is so immediate, because everyone knows what's happening in real time, because frustrations rise so quickly, because politicians take advantage of those frustrations, we may not have the luxury of a smooth transition to what comes next. We may not have the luxury of getting to a place where, yes, robots have the jobs in factories, but the factory-adjacent jobs are even greater than the jobs that have been lost to robots. So I actually believe there's a greater premium now, here again, on institutions to help us navigate, to put in some shock absorbers. But they have to be enlightened in ways that, that we haven't been. I guess I'd conclude with this. We have, I'll quote two Republican colleagues over the years in Washington, just coming from a political perspective on how they thought about the challenges they were facing. One was a political strategist by the name of Haley Barbour, and he said that in politics, as in most things, things are never as good as they seem, and they're never as bad as they seem. And so they tend to even out. That's the hopeful part. John McCain, one of our very well-known leaders around the world, he said, it's always darkest before it goes completely black. So you can decide where we are. All I can tell you is that I think this is one of the most challenging times to be in the work that you're doing. Maybe in some ways one of the most exciting times, precisely because it's so challenging. I like to say in government when we were and in foreign policy, the private sector, it's great to be in a growth industry. Foreign policy, not so great to be in a growth industry. Too many problems. I know you're feeling some of these same challenges, these same complexities. And I think finding the best guidance, the best ways to navigate through this, more important than ever.
Thank you so much, Antony, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A very rich and engaging exchange on the inner workings of US foreign policies. Ladies and gentlemen, Valérie Baudson and Secretary Blinken.